She had been told the house had a complicated past. That was the phrase the realtor used, complicated past, in the tone of someone describing a minor inconvenience rather than 30 years of legal paralysis. The Caldwell mansion had sat in probate limbo since 1994, the title contested by parties who had long since lost interest in contesting it, the records incomplete in ways that nobody had bothered to fully explain. The asking price reflected this. Margaret had looked at the number and then looked at the photographs and understood that the house was not being sold. It was being released, let go of, by a legal system that had held it long enough to be tired of it. She had bought it anyway. She was 68 years old, and she had spent 40 years as a preservation architect, and she knew the difference between a building that was broken and a building that was waiting. The Caldwell mansion was waiting. She could see it in the photographs, the particular quality of a structure that had been built with complete intention, every arch and stone placed by someone who understood that a building was not just shelter, but argument. An argument for permanence, for the right to occupy space and be remembered in it. The realtor had not known who built it. That had struck her as strange at the closing. A house of this scale, 3 stories dressed stone, the kind of craftsmanship that spoke to either significant wealth or significant will or both, and no clear record of its origin. The county file listed the first recorded owner as a trust established in 1901. Before that, gaps, legal descriptions without histories, a chain of title that began not at the beginning but somewhere in the middle, as if the earlier chapters had been removed rather than lost. She had noted this in her file and moved on. There was work to do. The workers she had hired for the initial structural assessment found the cellar on the 3rd day. Not the basement, the cellar. Below the basement, access through a flagstone floor panel that had been mortared over at some point and then relaid without mortar, as if someone had needed to access it again after the first ceiling and had not bothered to finish the job the second time. The panel lifted cleanly. Stone steps descended into darkness that smelled of cold earth and old lime, and something underneath both of those, something dry and preserved the smell of a space that had been sealed against the weather for a very long time. The workers called her down on a Tuesday afternoon. Margaret descended with a flashlight and stood at the base of the steps, while the beam moved across the cellar walls. Dressed stone, the same quality as the exterior, this was not a utility space dug as an afterthought, but a room built with the same care as everything above it. The walls were sound. The floor was dry. And along the far wall, where the amber light of one worker's lantern caught a section of stone that was slightly different in color from the surrounding courses, slightly lighter, slightly newer, laid with a different hand, there was a crack. Not a structural crack, a seam. Margaret crossed the cellar and ran her fingertips along it. A rectangular section of the wall approximately 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, set at chest height, the mortar between these stones softer than the mortar everywhere else. Someone had opened this section and resealed it. Someone had put something inside and closed the wall over it and gone away. She asked the workers for a pry bar. It took 20 minutes to clear enough stone to reach into the space behind the wall. The alcove was shallow 14 inches deep, lined on 3 sides with fitted stone dry throughout, and inside it centered on the stone shelf as if it had been set down with deliberate care, a tin box. Rectangular, the kind used for document storage in the late 19th century, the lid fitted tightly enough that the seal had held. Margaret lifted it out with both hands. It was lighter than she expected. The lightness of paper, of something that had been placed here not to be hidden but to be preserved, kept safe from the things that destroyed documents in ordinary houses, damp fire, the careless passage of time and ownership. She carried it upstairs to the kitchen table and set it in the light. She opened the lid. Inside, a single folded document wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had done its job for 130 years. She unwrapped it carefully, the oilcloth still supple at the folds, and opened the document on the table. A deed. Handwritten, the formal script of a careful hand, the ink brown with age but fully legible throughout. She read the property description. It matched precisely the legal description of the Caldwell mansion parcel. She read the consideration. She read the transfer language. And then she read the name in the grantee field, written in the same careful ink in letters slightly larger than the surrounding text, as if the person writing it had understood that this name needed to be legible above all else. Property of Josephine May Caldwell, November 12, 1889. Margaret stood at her kitchen table in the house she had bought for its complicated past and looked at the name for a long time. She had asked the realtor who built this house, and the realtor had not known. Now she knew. She thought about the woman who had written her own name into a deed and wrapped it in oilcloth and placed it inside a stone wall in a cellar below a house she had built herself, who had understood at some point before November 12, 1889, that the ordinary records of ownership were not going to be enough, that the truth was going to need a safer place than the county recorder's office, that someone was going to have to go into the dark to find it. She built this house, Margaret thought. Every room, every arch, every stone. And then someone took it from her. So she hid the truth where only someone patient enough and careful enough and willing enough to go into the dark would find it. Margaret sat down at the table. She had thought she was buying a house with a complicated past. She was beginning to understand that she had been trusted with something else entirely. Margaret drove the last 12 miles alone. She had not told anyone she was making this trip, not her colleague at the preservation firm, not her daughter in Portland, not the estate lawyer who had called 3 weeks ago with the news that a distant cousin she had met exactly twice had died and left her a house in rural Virginia. She had listened to the lawyer's summary, asked 2 questions about the title status, and written the address in her work notebook under the date. Then she had driven. She was 68 years old, and she had spent 4 decades assessing buildings that other people had given up on, and she had learned in that work that first impressions required solitude. Other people's reactions contaminated the reading. You needed to walk a building alone with your own senses and your own silence before you allowed anyone else's opinion into the space. The lawyer had offered to meet her there. She had said no. He had said before she hung up, "It's been contested, transferred, abandoned, and relisted 4 times. Nobody has lived there since 1971. I want to make sure you understand what you're accepting." She had said she would call him after she'd walked it. She pulled off the county road onto a gravel drive that had not been maintained in recent years, the gravel thin in the center, the edges grown over the tree line on both sides, close enough that the canopy met overhead, and made a tunnel of the approach. She drove slowly following the curve, and then the trees opened and the house was there. She stopped the car and looked at it through the windshield for a long moment. Grand was the right word. Not in the way of houses built to impress, in the way of houses built to last. 3 stories of dressed stone, the courses laid with a precision that was not common in residential construction of any era, the corners dressed and true, after 130 years of weather. The front elevation had 4 windows on each of the upper floors, the proportions exact, the rhythm deliberate. 2 arched openings flanked the central entrance. Someone had understood when they designed this that an arch was not decoration, but argument, a structural choice that said permanence, said intention, said I built this to be here after I am gone. The stained glass in the upper windows was intact. Even from the drive, she could see it the deep amber and green of period glass, still holding its color, still doing what it had been made to do. She got out of the car and stood on the gravel for a moment, looking at the house the way she looked at all the buildings she assessed, not at its condition, not yet, but at its character. What it had been built to be. Who had built it, thinking what? She went inside. The front door opened on the second try, the lock stiff from years of infrequent use but functional, the door itself solid and true in its frame. The entry hall was wider than she expected, the proportions generous in a way that spoke to someone who had thought carefully about how a house received people. The parquet floor was still sound underfoot, the inlay pattern intact, the wood dried but not damaged. Her footsteps had a clean, firm sound. Good subfloor, good joinery. Someone had built this floor to be walked on for generations, and it had been, and it still was. She moved through the rooms methodically, the way she always worked. Ground floor, first exterior walls, then interior partitions, then up. She noted the plaster in the parlor cracked in the upper corners but not failing. The kitchen fireplace still structurally sound, the hearthstone level. The back hallway with its original hardware, the door hinges heavy cast iron, the kind that outlasted the wood around them. The smell of the house was old wood and cold stone, and beneath both of those something older, the particular combination of lime mortar and settled earth that belonged to buildings from this period, the smell of a structure that had found its equilibrium with the ground beneath it and stopped shifting. She stopped in the main parlor. The walls held the ghosts of portraits. She could see them clearly, rectangular patches of slightly lighter paint, unfaded where frames had protected the surface from a century of light and air. 6 of them on the parlor walls alone. Whoever had removed them had taken everyone, leaving nothing behind but the outlines of their absence. She stood in front of the largest ghost centered above the fireplace, the proportions of a formal portrait, and looked at it for a moment, removed deliberately, not lost to time or weather, taken. She photographed the wall and moved on. Upstairs from the front bedroom window, she noticed the man at the road. He was perhaps 75, standing at the fence line where the property met the county road, leaning on a fence post with the particular stillness of someone who had been there for a while and intended to stay. He was looking at the house. Not at her, at the house, the way people look at buildings they have been watching for a long time. He did not move when she appeared in the window. He did not approach. She noted him the way she noted everything factually without conclusion. A neighbor, possibly. Someone who remembered the property from before. She would find out in time. She came back downstairs and crouched at the main staircase on her way through the entry hall, running her hand along the underside of the banister, the way she did with any significant millwork, checking for condition, for the quality of the joinery, for what the underside revealed about how the piece had been made. She found the initials with her fingertips before she saw them, carved into the wood on the underside of the newel post, where no one standing or passing would ever see them. Small, deliberate, the cuts clean and careful, made by someone who knew how to use a blade and had chosen this specific location with intention. Not vandalism, not a child's impulse. The placement was considered too protected. This was someone marking something they wanted to last. She angled her flashlight up. JMC 1889. She photographed them. 3 frames, different angles, making sure the date was legible in at least 2. Then she straightened up and stood in the entry hall for a moment, looking at the staircase above her, the proportions, the craftsmanship, the care visible in every joint and baluster. Someone had built this house in 1889 and carved their initials into the underside of the banister where they would be found only by someone who thought to look. Hidden but intentional, protected but present. She filed it and went to find the cellar. The workers had flagged the east wall in their preliminary survey, a note in the margin of the structural report foundation survey recommended before purchase closes. Moisture variation in east corner. She had read it and noted it, and now she stood at the base of the stone steps with her flashlight and looked at the wall directly. It was sound. She could see that immediately the structural courses were solid, the pointing intact throughout most of the surface, the wall plumb and stable. But near the base of the east corner where the workers had placed their flag, the mortar was a different color. Not dramatically, not in a way that would catch an untrained eye, but she had been reading stone walls for 40 years, and she could see it clearly in the flashlight beam, a different mix, a different era applied over an older surface. And the stones themselves, in a rectangular section approximately 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, set at chest height, their edges were slightly sharper than the stones around them, less weathered, less time in the wall. They had been moved and then replaced. Margaret put her hand flat on the cold stone and felt the wall beneath her palm, solid, still the particular solidity of dressed stone that had been in place for a very long time. But the air near the east corner was different, drier, stiller, the air of a space that had been sealed against the outside, deliberately and completely. She leaned in closer. She brought the flashlight to the seam and followed it with the beam top, sides, bottom. A clean rectangle, intentional edges. Someone had opened this section of wall and resealed it, and had done the resealing with care, but not with the same hand that had laid the original courses. Someone had put something inside this wall, and then someone had closed it over and gone away. If you want to know what's behind that cellar wall and whose initials were carved beneath that staircase in 1889, stay with me. She finalized the purchase on a Thursday. The lawyer had not been surprised. He had the expression of a man who had presented this property to enough people to have stopped predicting their decisions, and he processed the paperwork with the efficient neutrality of someone who had done his due diligence and was now simply completing a transaction. He handed her the keys, 2 of them old brass, on a plain ring, and wished her well, and that was that. Margaret drove directly from the lawyer's office to the county recorder's office. She had learned in 40 years of preservation work that a building's paper history was as structural as its stone. You could not understand what a building was without understanding what had been done to it on paper, who had owned it, how it had changed hands, what the records said, and what they omitted. The gaps in a title chain were as informative as the entries, sometimes more so. The county recorder's office occupied the ground floor of a municipal building that had been built in the 1940s and not significantly updated since fluorescent lighting linoleum floors, the particular institutional smell of paper stored in quantity. She gave the clerk the property address and the parcel number from the survey and asked for the complete title chain. The clerk returned with a folder thick enough to suggest a complicated history and set it on the counter without comment. Margaret opened it and worked from the back forward, oldest records first, the way she always read a title chain. The earliest document in the file was dated 1889. A deed of construction and first ownership, the standard form of the period the property described in the same legal language she had seen on the document from the tin box. The named owner on the 1889 deed was T. Caldwell. Thomas, she assumed. A single initial, the standard convention for the period, concealing as much as it revealed. She turned to the next document, 1893, a transfer deed. The grantor Caldwell Estate. The grantee Pembroke Holdings, A. Pembroke Principal. She read the consideration amount twice because the first reading seemed unlikely. It was not a number that matched a property of the Caldwell Mansion scale, not in 1893, and not in any year she could reasonably calculate. For a 3-story dressed stone residence on several acres of rural Virginia, the figure was not low, it was implausible. The kind of number that appeared on transfers where the consideration was either symbolic or concealed. She looked for an auction record. There was none. No probate filing in the county record, no court order authorizing the estate transfer. The Caldwell estate had transferred the property to Pembroke Holdings in March of 1893 through what appeared on the face of the documents to be a straightforward private sale, except that nothing about it was straightforward, and the records that should have surrounded such a transaction were simply absent. She set the transfer deed aside and went back to the 1889 document. T. Caldwell. The deed of construction listed Thomas Caldwell as the sole owner of record. She read it 3 times, looking for a second name, a joint tenancy notation, a separate addendum. There was nothing. On paper, in the county's official record, Thomas Caldwell had built the Caldwell Mansion alone. She closed the folder and looked at the clerk. Is there a Josephine Caldwell anywhere in these records, any document, any year? The clerk typed for a moment, reviewed the results, typed again. 1 mention, she said. A city directory, 1891. She turned the monitor slightly so Margaret could read it. Mrs. J. Caldwell, Caldwell Residence, Magnolia Hill. 1 line in a city directory, the kind of casual civic record that listed residents without legal weight. Mrs. J. Caldwell at the house on Magnolia Hill in 1891. And then the 1893 transfer deed. Her name not on it, not anywhere in the transaction, not in the grantor field, not in any attached document, not in any notation in the margin. Between 1891 and 1893, Josephine Caldwell had been removed from her own property as completely as the portraits had been removed from her parlor walls. What remained was the outline of her absence. Margaret photographed every page of the title chain and drove to the public library. The librarian's name was Helen. She introduced herself with the directness of someone who had spent a career making information accessible and had no patience for preamble. She was perhaps 60, precise in her movements, the kind of person who knew where everything in her archive was without consulting a finding aid. When Margaret explained what she was looking for newspaper coverage of the Caldwell property between 1889 and 1893, Helen led her to a reading room at the back of the building and returned in 4 minutes with 2 archive boxes. 1890 and 1891, Helen said. The 1892 file has some water damage, but I can pull it if you need it. Margaret worked through the 1890 papers first methodically, the way she had worked through the title chain, looking for names for the property, for any mention of the Caldwell mansion's construction or ownership. She found the first reference in a spring 1890 edition of the County Weekly, a brief social notice about a reception held at Mrs. Josephine Caldwell's magnificent new residence on Magnolia Hill. Her name, in print, in 1890. She turned to the 1891 file. 2 more mentions a summer gathering reported in the social pages Mrs. Josephine Caldwell, as hostess the residence described with the particular admiration the county paper reserved for properties it considered noteworthy. And a 3rd mention in the autumn edition, a charitable event, Mrs. Caldwell's name in the first sentence. 3 separate newspaper references, all from before the 1893 transfer, all naming Josephine Caldwell as the owner of the residence. Not Mrs. Thomas Caldwell, not the Caldwell family, Josephine, her name, her house. The newspaper had known. Helen had been reading over her shoulder quietly with the focused attention of someone assembling the same picture from the same pieces. The deed lists only Thomas, Helen said, but the newspaper knew it was hers. Margaret looked at the 3 clippings laid side by side on the reading table. Josephine Caldwell in print in her own house in 1890 and 1891, and then the 1893 transfer deed bearing the name of the Caldwell estate, conveying the property to Pembroke Holdings at an implausible price, with no probate record and no auction, and no explanation for how an estate had transferred a property that the county newspaper had been describing as Josephine Caldwell's 2 years earlier. Helen reached for the transfer deed from the folder Margaret had brought from the recorder's office. She held it under the reading room light, tilting it slightly the way you angle a document when you are looking at something specific, rather than reading the text. She was quiet for a moment. Then, look at the signature on the transfer deed. Margaret leaned in. Thomas Caldwell is listed as the estate grantor, Helen said. Her voice was steady and careful, the voice of someone delivering a fact rather than an interpretation. But Thomas Caldwell died in October 1891. She set the document flat on the table. This deed is dated March 1893. The reading room was very quiet. Helen looked at Margaret across the table. That's not his signature. The call came on a Tuesday morning. The Foundation survey crew had been on site since Monday, working through the systematic assessment Margaret had commissioned before committing to the full restoration plan. She had hired them specifically for this kind of work, older buildings with complicated structural histories, the kind of assessment that required patience and experience rather than speed. The crew chief was a man named Gerald, who had been doing foundation work for 30 years and who communicated in the compressed factual language of someone who had learned that unnecessary words wasted time. He called at 9:15. "You need to come see this." She was there in 40 minutes. Gerald met her at the side entrance and led her through the main hall and down the cellar steps without preamble. His crew had been working on the east wall since early morning. The anomalous section, the rectangle of differently colored mortar she had noticed on her first walk through the stones with the sharper edges, had been carefully removed and set aside in the order it had come out, each stone numbered in chalk on its face, so it could be replaced in sequence if needed. Behind it was not a foundation cavity. Behind it was a passage. Margaret stood at the opening and looked into it with her flashlight for a long moment before she stepped through. The passage was narrow, wide enough for one person moving carefully, the ceiling low enough that she would need to angle her head slightly throughout. The walls were hand-cut stone, dressed with the same care as the cellar walls, but older in character. The tool marks different, the courses slightly irregular in the way of work, done before the construction methods of the 1880s had standardized certain techniques. This passage had not been built when the mansion was built. It was earlier. or it had been built separately by a different hand with a different purpose. She called Helen from the cellar steps. Helen arrived within the hour which told Margaret she had been waiting for the call. She came with 2 battery lanterns and a canvas bag, and the focused quiet of someone who had spent the morning thinking about the same questions Margaret had been thinking about and was now ready to follow them wherever they led. They entered the passage together. The ceiling was low enough that they both moved at a careful angle, the lantern light moving across the walls in warm arcs as they walked. The passage ran east beneath the mansion's main wing, the direction and distance consistent with the building's footprint above. Margaret counted her steps. The floor was smooth stone dry, without the unevenness of a natural formation. This had been leveled, deliberately laid flat, and even with the particular care of someone who intended to walk it regularly. Not a utility tunnel. There were no pipes along the walls, no drainage channels cut into the floor, no evidence of any functional infrastructure. The walls were smooth, throughout, not rough cut, not merely functional, but finished. Someone had built this passage with the same attention they brought to the rooms above, and had built it for a purpose that had nothing to do with plumbing or drainage or the mechanical needs of a large house. Helen ran her hand along the left wall as they walked and said nothing for a long time. The passage ended at approximately 40 feet from the cellar entrance. The far end was not a wall, it was an alcove set back from the tunnel's terminus, a widening of the space that created a niche approximately 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep. The walls of the alcove were brick, not stone, a different material from everything surrounding it added after the tunnel's original construction. The brick was newer than the stone, the mortar between the courses a lighter color, the work done at a later date by someone who had come into this finished tunnel and built something additional inside it. Margaret stood in front of the alcove and looked at it for a moment before touching anything. The brick niche was set at a specific height. She registered this before she registered anything else about it, not at floor level, not at the height of a utility installation, but at approximately 5 feet from the ground. Standing woman height. The height at which a person of average female stature could reach comfortably, could place something carefully, could retrieve it without difficulty. The placement was not incidental. It was chosen. She looked at Helen. Helen looked at the niche. Neither of them spoke. Margaret took the small pry bar Gerald had left at the tunnel entrance and worked it gently into the mortar at the niche's left edge. The mortar was harder than she expected in some places, and softer in others, inconsistently applied, as if it had been laid quickly rather than carefully, with more attention to sealing the space than to the quality of the joint. She worked slowly, loosening the mortar in sections, keeping the brick intact. The first brick came away cleanly. Too cleanly. The fit was precise but not bonded. The mortar had been applied at the face, rather than packed behind, creating a seal that looked permanent from the front, but was designed to yield to a careful hand from the same direction. Someone had built this to be opened again. Someone had sealed it, knowing the seal would need to come away. The second and third bricks followed in the same manner. Margaret cleared the opening and held the lantern up to the space behind. The alcove was shallow, perhaps 14 inches deep, the walls stone, the floor stone, the surface smooth and dry throughout. The air that came out when the bricks were removed was still and cold, and had the particular quality she had noticed in the cellar on her first visit, sealed air, preserved air, the air of a space that had been closed against the world deliberately and had simply waited. Inside the alcove, centered on the stone floor of the niche, wrapped in oilcloth, tied with a length of cord that had dried to the texture of old rope. A tin box, rectangular, the proportions of a document storage box, the kind manufactured in the late 19th century for the preservation of papers in conditions where damp was a concern. The oilcloth had done its work 130 years in a sealed stone alcove in a dry tunnel, and the wrapping was intact. The cord still holding the tin beneath it, untouched by the moisture that would have destroyed an unprotected document in a fraction of that time. Margaret crouched in the low space of the alcove and lifted the box with both hands. It was heavier than she expected. Not heavy in the way of metal or soil, heavy in the way of paper, of several documents stacked together, of something that had been placed here with the weight of intention rather than the weight of material. Something shifted inside as she lifted it. Papers. More than one. She did not open it in the tunnel. She carried it against her chest, cradled in both arms, back through the 40 feet of passage, and up the stone steps and through the cellar and up the main stairs to the kitchen, where the afternoon light came through the windows and fell across the table in the long, steady rectangles of a day that had no opinion about what it was illuminating. She set the box on the table. She wiped the oilcloth clean with a dry cloth slowly, the way she cleaned every significant object before examining it, not from ceremony but from the simple discipline of seeing clearly. The tin beneath the wrapping was intact. The lid fitted tightly, a single flat latch at the front. "No lock?" She looked at the latch for a moment, then at Helen, who had set her lantern on the counter and was standing very still on the other side of the table. Margaret opened the latch. She lifted the lid. The first thing she saw was a folded document on top, the topmost paper in a stack of several, wrapped in a second layer of oilcloth that had kept the contents in the same condition as the outer wrapping. She unfolded it carefully, the oilcloth falling away from paper that was dry and firm and fully intact after 130 years of patient waiting. A deed. She read from the top in order: the property description, the legal language, the consideration, and then the name in the grantee field written in careful ink in letters slightly larger than the text around them, as if the person writing it had understood that above all else this name needed to be legible. Josephine May Caldwell, November 12, 1889. Margaret set the document flat on the kitchen table and looked at the name. Outside, the afternoon light moved across the floor in its slow way, unhurried, indifferent to what had just been found at the table it was crossing. Helen stood on the other side of the table and looked at the name for a long time without speaking. Then she said quietly, "She put it there herself." It was not a question. She cleared the kitchen table completely before she began. Not from ceremony, from the same professional habit that had governed 40 years of document work. A clear surface, good light, nothing competing for attention. She moved her coffee mug to the counter, folded her jacket over the back of the chair, and positioned herself at the east-facing window where the morning light came in, flat and even and without shadow. Helen sat across from her with a notepad and said nothing. They had already established, without discussing it, that this required the same silence they had brought to the tunnel. Margaret lifted the tin box onto the table and opened it. She removed the contents one at a time, setting each item to the right of the box in the order it had been placed, which she understood was the order Josephine had intended. The deed first. She had already read it once in the moment of opening. She read it again now, fully in the morning light, with the county title chain photographs on the table beside it for direct comparison. The property description matched exactly every boundary, every measurement, every legal reference. This was the same parcel. The same house. The deed was dated November 12, 1889, and it was a deed of original ownership, the document that established who held title at the moment of first legal occupancy. The named owner was Josephine May Caldwell. Not Thomas, not T. Caldwell, not the Caldwell estate. Josephine May Caldwell, her full name in the grantee field in careful ink in the formal legal hand of a document prepared by someone who understood that precision in this field was not optional. Thomas Caldwell's name was not on this deed, not as co-owner, not as joint tenant, not in any capacity. This property, on the day it was legally established, had belonged to one person. Margaret set the deed carefully to the right and reached into the box. The second item was a roll of papers tied with a narrow ribbon, blue faded to a pale gray blue with age still holding its bow. She untied it with 2 fingers and unrolled the papers slowly, holding the edges flat against the table with her palms as they resisted the curl of 130 years. Architectural drawings. 6 of them on drafting paper that had preserved its integrity in the dry, sealed air of the tunnel alcove. The lines were drawn in pencil and ink, the pencil for construction lines and the ink for the final rendering, the technique standard for architectural drafting of the period. She recognized the style immediately, not from Josephine specifically, but from the period, from the conventions of hand-drafted architectural work before the standardization of professional drawing practice. These were working drawings, not presentation drawings. They had been used. The edges were worn at the corners from handling, and there were small notations in the margins. Measurements confirm material specifications. A note about the stone-cutting sequence for the east elevation. She looked at the date on the first drawing, 1887, the second, 1887, the third, 1888, the fourth and fifth, 1889, the sixth, a final site plan with the building footprint and the approach drive, and the mature tree line drawn in careful strokes. 1889, with a notation in the lower margin that read, "Foundation complete, ready for superstructure." In the lower right corner of each drawing, in the same careful hand as the deed, the same hand as everything in this box, J. Caldwell. Margaret set the drawings in a line across the table and looked at them for a long moment. Then she stood up and walked to the parlor doorway. She looked at the staircase arch from the entry hall, the proportion, the radius, the way the arch met the side walls, at exactly the angle she had noticed on her first walk-through, as being slightly unusual for the period, slightly more considered than the standard residential detail. She went back to the table and found the interior elevation drawing from 1888. The staircase arch was drawn there, precisely the same radius, the same proportions, the same meeting angle, annotated in Josephine's hand with a measurement and a note she read twice before she understood it. Let the eye rise before the foot does. She walked to the east wall of the kitchen. The window placement, 3 windows, the center one slightly larger than the flanking 2, positioned to catch the morning light at a specific angle. She had noticed the quality of the morning light in this room immediately on her first visit without understanding why it was so precisely calibrated. She found the kitchen elevation in the 1889 drawings. The 3 windows were there, the center one marked with a notation morning east primary. She went back to the table and stood looking at the drawings and the deed and the room around her. Josephine May Caldwell had not commissioned this house. She had designed it. She had drafted every room, every arch, every window placement, every proportion beginning in 1887 and carrying the drawings through 2 years of revision to the final construction documents. She had stood in the field with these drawings and supervised the stonecutters and the carpenters and the glaziers. The initials carved into the underside of the newel post, JMC 1889, were not a mark of ownership. They were a signature. The signature of the person who had made the thing. Helen was looking at the drawings from across the table, reading the corner signatures. Her expression, the focused stillness of someone assembling a picture they had begun to form and were now seeing fully. Margaret reached into the box. The third item was a contract, formal, printed on heavy legal paper, the typeface of a commercial document prepared by a lawyer's office. She read the header, a business partnership agreement between Thomas Caldwell and Arthur Pembroke, dated June 1891. She read through the standard partnership language, capital contributions, profit-sharing management responsibilities, the commercial venture they were entering into together. She read it methodically, clause by clause, the way she read all legal documents without skipping. She found it in Clause 7. It was not highlighted. It was not set apart from the surrounding language in any way. It sat in the middle of a dense paragraph about partnership obligations and security interests written in the compressed legal prose of the period, the kind of language that required careful reading to parse, and that could be absorbed without full comprehension by someone reading quickly or trusting the person who had prepared it. Including all real property held in the name of the Caldwell estate as collateral security for partnership obligations. All real property in the name of the Caldwell estate. Thomas Caldwell had signed his wife's house into a business partnership agreement as collateral. Whether he had understood precisely what he was signing, whether he had read Clause 7 with the attention it required, whether he had known that the house was in Josephine's name and understood the implication of pledging it against partnership obligations, the document did not say. Documents recorded what was signed, not what was understood at the moment of signing. Thomas Caldwell died in October 1891, 4 months after signing this contract. Arthur Pembroke had filed the 1893 transfer deed 18 months later. Margaret set the contract beside the deed and looked at both of them together, the document that had established Josephine's ownership and the document that had handed her house to the man who would take it. She reached into the box for the fourth item, A single sheet of paper folded once written in a hand she recognized now as Josephine's, the same careful, deliberate script as the deed and the architectural notations, but different in character. Less formal. The writing of a person not drafting a document, but recording a fact before it could be lost. No date. Written after Thomas died, she understood this before she read the first line from something in the quality of the writing itself, the particular pressure of a person writing in the aftermath of something. She read it slowly. Thomas did not understand what he signed. He trusted Arthur, as he trusted everyone. I did not know until Mr. Pembroke arrived with the papers. I have no legal standing. I have nowhere to appeal. A line break. Then, I am writing this so that someone will know. I built this house. It was mine. Margaret read it twice. Then she set it on the table beside the architectural drawings beside the 1887 elevation with its careful pencil lines and its annotated measurements and its corner signature J. Caldwell, the signature of someone who had understood from the beginning that making something and owning something were the same act, and that both required documentation, and that documentation required a safe place. She looked at the east window. The morning light came through it at the angle Josephine had calculated in 1889, falling across the table, and the drawings and the deed and the note in the same warm rectangle it had been making in this kitchen for 130 years. Walter Pembroke was standing at the fence line. Same post, same stillness. He was looking at the house the way he had been looking at it every time she had noticed him. Not with ownership or longing exactly, but with the particular quality of someone who has been waiting for something to happen and is not sure whether to be relieved or afraid that it finally is. She understood now why he was there. He had been waiting since before she arrived. Have you ever found something in an old house, an old box, a family document that made you see the whole story differently? Tell me in the comments. The man who inherited the secret. Margaret walked out to the road with the architectural sketch in her hand. She did not hurry. The house behind her stood in the morning light with its east windows open to the same angle Josephine Caldwell had calculated more than a century earlier. On the kitchen table, the deed, the drawings, the partnership agreement, and Josephine's written note remained exactly where Margaret had placed them lined up, in the order they had changed the story. Helen had not followed her. That was right. Some conversations needed a witness, and some needed the dignity of being carried alone. Walter Pembroke was still at the fence line. He stood near the old oak by the gate, one hand resting on the top rail, his shoulders slightly forward, his hat low against the wind. He had not moved when Margaret first saw him through the window. He did not move now as she crossed the yard toward him. Only his eyes changed. He saw the paper in her hand. Then he looked at the house, then back at Margaret. For a moment neither of them spoke. The late morning had gone quiet in the particular way old properties become quiet when the wind pauses. Somewhere beyond the tree line a bird called once and then stopped. The oak branches moved above the gate with a dry, low sound. Margaret stopped on the inside of the fence. Walter remained on the roadside. The rail between them felt less like a boundary than an old line someone had drawn long before either of them was born. Margaret held up the architectural sketch. Do you know whose initials are under the staircase? Walter closed his eyes, not as if he were surprised, as if he had been waiting for the question so long that hearing it aloud finally gave his body permission to admit it had expected this. When he opened his eyes, he said yes. Margaret did not ask the next question immediately. She let the answer sit between them. Walter looked older than he had from the window, 80 perhaps. Maybe more. His face had the careful stillness of a man who had spent decades trying not to show what he carried, only to discover that age had made concealment less obedient. His hands were broad-veined and weathered the hands of someone who had worked land or machinery or both. His right thumb moved once against the fence rail, then stopped. Margaret said, "How long have you known?" Walter looked past her toward the house. "I was 19. The number entered the morning like a date written into a ledger. Margaret waited. Walter took off his hat and held it against his chest. The gesture was old-fashioned, almost formal, and somehow that made it worse. "My grandfather died that winter," he said. "Arthur Pembroke. He left papers in a cedar trunk in the upstairs closet. My father didn't want them, said old men saved too much. I was curious. 19-year-old boys are curious in the wrong ways sometimes. His mouth moved once, not a smile. I found the letter first, Arthur's letter to his lawyer, 1893. Margaret said nothing. Walter looked at the sketch in her hand. I've read it hundreds of times, he said. I have never been able to make it mean something other than what it means. The wind moved through the oak again. Margaret lowered the sketch slightly. Walter continued, not quickly, not dramatically. He spoke like a man reciting something he had rehearsed in silence for most of his life, and still did not trust himself to say well. My grandfather wrote that the widow had no legal standing, that Thomas Caldwell had pledged the house through the partnership, and that the transfer could be completed if handled promptly. He wrote that the county recorder would accept the filing if no challenge came within the proper window. He swallowed. Then he wrote that Mrs. Caldwell had removed herself to the city. The matter was resolved. Margaret heard Josephine's note in her mind. I have no legal standing. I have nowhere to appeal. I built this house. It was mine? Walter's voice lowered. I was 19 when I understood that my family's land was not all my family's land. Not in the way people meant it, not cleanly. He put his hat back on, perhaps because his hands needed something to finish. I did not steal this house, Mrs. Hale. Margaret looked at him. No, she said. He nodded once, accepting neither forgiveness nor accusation. But I inherited what came after. There it was. Not a defense, not enough to be confession, not yet, but the first honest shape of it. Walter looked toward the front elevation of the mansion, at the arches Josephine had drawn, at the stones she had measured, at the windows she had placed for light she would not be allowed to keep. My father inherited it from Arthur. I inherited from my father. Then pieces were sold, divided, leased, mortgaged, developed. We built a name from it. Pembroke Holdings, Pembroke Farms, Pembroke Roads, Pembroke Acres. He paused. Some years I told myself it was history. Some years I told myself history was full of unfair things, and that one old wrong could not be pulled loose without pulling everything else apart. Margaret stayed quiet. Her silence did not invite him to continue. It required him to. Walter looked down at the grass by the fence post. Some years it was guilt. Some years it was justification. Some years it was just the dull weight of knowing. He looked up again. I am not proud of any of those years. Margaret studied him carefully. He was not a villain laying out a grand scheme. He was not a man asking to be admired for finally telling the truth. He was simply old and tired and standing at the edge of a property that had outlasted every lie told about it. What made you come here? Margaret asked. Walter looked toward the house. When I heard it had finally sold out of probate, I thought maybe the papers would stay buried. Then I saw your name. My name? You restored the Miller Courthouse and the old Bellamy Schoolhouse. I read about both. His expression shifted almost painfully. You know buildings. You know when something has been altered. Margaret thought of the seam in the cellar wall, the stone alcove, the tin box placed with intention, Josephine's documents waiting behind the wall in a house designed to hold its own witness. Walter said I thought if anyone would find her, it might be you. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Then why didn't you bring me the papers yourself? The question did not strike him. It settled on him. He nodded once. Because I was a coward. There was no performance in the answer. No self-pity. Just the fact. Then Walter turned toward his car. I brought them, he said. He walked slowly to the old sedan parked beside the road, opened the rear door, and lifted something from the floorboard with both hands. A wooden box. Dark wood, old, latched at the front with brass that had gone dull. Not large, but heavy enough that Walter carried it carefully, as though the weight was not only physical. He returned to the fence and set the box on the top rail between them. This was Arthur's, he said. Margaret did not touch it yet. Walter opened the latch. Inside were papers bundled with cloth tape, letters, legal copies, a folded transfer document, a smaller envelope marked 1895 in a hand different from Josephine's and more angular than Thomas's. Arthur Pembroke's hand, Margaret thought. Walter lifted the first letter and unfolded it. My grandfather's letter to his lawyer, he said. September 1893. He handed it to her. Margaret read the line near the middle first because Walter's finger had rested beside it. The widow has no legal standing. The matter is resolved. The words were formal, dry, nearly bloodless. That made them worse. A sentence like that did not need cruelty in its tone. It had been written by a man confident that paperwork could make a person disappear. Walter removed another document. The transfer filing, he said. The original copy my grandfather kept. You'll see the discrepancy in the description. Small, but enough. Your deed in the wall proves what this tried to erase. Margaret accepted it. Then Walter took out the smaller 1895 letter. His hand trembled slightly before he gave it to her. This is the one I hated most. Margaret unfolded it. The widow has removed herself to the city. No further inquiry is expected. The matter is resolved. For a moment the road, the oak, the fence, and the house seemed to pull into a single point of silence. Margaret thought of Josephine packing whatever she could carry, leaving the rooms she had designed, leaving the staircase with her initials beneath it, leaving the kitchen windows she had placed to catch the morning light, removed herself. As if grief and dispossession were choices made neatly. Walter's voice came quieter. My family kept these because men like Arthur kept proof even when proof damned them. I don't know why. Pride, maybe. Insurance. Habit. He closed the box halfway, then opened it again, as if he had not finished earning the right to stop. I have been waiting for someone who would know what to do with these. Margaret looked at him. I'm 80 years old, Walter said. I've waited long enough. He placed both hands on the box and slid it fully across the fence rail toward her. Margaret took it. It was heavier than she expected, or perhaps she had expected it to be heavy in a different way. Walter's hands remained on the rail after the box left them. Empty now, but not free. Not yet. He looked at the house again, and when he spoke, the question seemed to come from somewhere very far back in him. Is there anything left of her name on this property? Margaret knew immediately what he meant. Not a document, not a legal line. A trace, a mark, something Josephine had left where no clerk, husband, partner, lawyer, or Pembroke could amend it. Margaret thought of the underside of the staircase, the place no one looked unless they were working close enough, carefully enough, to notice what had been carved into the wood. JMC 1889. She said yes. Walter turned to her. Margaret held the wooden box against her side and looked back toward the house. Under the staircase, she said, on the underside of the newel, JMC 1889. Walter closed his eyes. For several seconds he did not move. The wind passed through the oak again, and this time the sound seemed less like a warning than a long breath finally leaving a room. When Walter opened his eyes, Margaret saw something in his face had shifted. Not relief. Relief was too clean a word. It was more like the weight had changed shape. Not gone, not forgiven, but no longer only his to carry in silence. She signed it, he said. Yes, Margaret said. She did. Walter looked at the house, then at the box in Margaret's arms. Then give it back to her, he said. Margaret did not answer immediately. She looked at the old man at the fence at the house behind her, at the documents in her arms, at the road that had carried families past this property for more than a century, without any of them knowing whose story had been sealed inside its walls. Then she nodded. I will! The woman who built Caldwell House. Margaret returned to the kitchen with Walter Pembroke's wooden box held against her side. Helen was still at the table. She had not moved the documents. The deed remained where Margaret had left it. Josephine May Caldwell's name, resting in the morning light, as if the paper had been waiting 130 years for a room quiet enough to read it properly. The architectural drawings were still arranged in a careful line beside it. The partnership agreement sat open to Clause 7. Josephine's handwritten note lay beside the drawings, small and plain, and more devastating than any legal document on the table. I built this house. It was mine. Helen looked up when Margaret came in. She saw the box first, then Margaret's face. Neither woman spoke immediately. Margaret set Walter's wooden box on the table beside the tin box from the tunnel. The two boxes looked wrong together at first, one tin, one wood. one hidden by the woman who had been erased, one kept by the family that had benefited from the erasure. But once they were open, once the papers began to spread across the table, they seemed less like opposites than two halves of the same wound. Helen closed her notepad. "Is that from him?" Margaret nodded. "Arthur Pembroke's papers." Helen's eyes moved from the wooden box to the deed. "He kept them. His family did." Margaret removed the Pembroke letters one at a time and placed them beneath the partnership agreement. She set the forged transfer copy beside Josephine's original deed. She placed the 1895 letter, the one that said, "The widow had removed herself to the city," beside Josephine's note saying she had nowhere to appeal. The table became a kind of courtroom. No judge, no jury, only paper light and two women willing to read what men had expected time to soften. Together, they began reconstructing Josephine's life, not from memory. There was no living memory left, not from family stories, because the wrong family had kept most of those. They reconstructed her from primary sources, deeds, directories, newspaper notices, marginal notes, architectural drawings, old contracts, and the terrible precision of official records. Helen started with the city archive copies she had brought from the Historical Society. Josephine May Caldwell, she read. Born 1861. Margaret looked up. Born free. Helen nodded slowly. Born free. Her father is listed as Elias May, carpenter, later builder, property owner by 1872. Margaret sat back in her chair. A man who built carefully. A man who left carefully. That made sense now. Josephine had not learned precision from nowhere. Someone had taught her that woodstone paper and ownership all required the same thing, careful measuring, before anyone else entered the room to tell you what could not be done. Helen continued. There's a school record, private academy, 1874 to 1878. She would have been educated. Margaret looked at the architectural drawings. She had to be. The evidence was there in every line, not amateur enthusiasm, not decorative interest. The drawings had discipline. They had proportion. They had the restraint of someone who knew exactly what a room should ask of light, where weight should travel, how the eye should move before the foot did. Josephine had been 26 when she began commissioning Caldwell House. 26. Younger than Margaret had imagined. Not an old widow hiding proof after loss. Not yet. A young woman with inherited capital, training, ambition, and a vision large enough to become stone. The newspaper records did not call her that. Helen found the first mention in an 1888 Society column. Mrs. Thomas Caldwell has taken great interest in the construction of their country residence. Margaret's mouth tightened. Mrs. Thomas Caldwell, not Josephine May Caldwell. Not designer. Not owner. Not the woman whose initials were carved beneath the staircase and whose name stood alone on the original deed. Filtered through Thomas. Reduced by the newspaper to a wife standing beside a project she had drawn with her own hand. Helen read another. Mrs. Caldwell is said to have a refined eye for domestic arrangement. Margaret let out a small breath. It was not quite a laugh. Domestic arrangement. Helen looked at the drawings spread across the table, elevation site, plan, staircase, arch, kitchen windows, stone-cutting sequence. She designed the house, yes, Margaret said. But they only had language for what they were willing to see. She stood and walked to the parlor. The room seemed different now. Not changed, revealed. The arch into the entry hall held its curve with the same quiet intelligence it had held since 1889. Margaret stopped beneath it and looked up, remembering the notation on Josephine's interior elevation. Let the eye rise before the foot does. She had thought that was beautiful when she first read it. Now it felt like biography. Josephine had built a house that invited a person to look upward before moving forward, a house that instructed the body in dignity before it allowed the body to cross a room. Margaret moved slowly through the parlor, the window placement, the proportions, the way the fireplace did not dominate the wall but anchored it, the way the morning light from the kitchen still seemed to reach the room indirectly softened by thresholds Josephine had planned. Helen followed but said nothing. She understood that Margaret was not inspecting the room now. She was meeting its maker. At the far side of the parlor stood an old chair that had come with the house, not original, probably mid-century, but placed near the window where a woman might have sat to watch the drive. Margaret lowered herself into it. For a long moment she did not speak. She imagined Josephine sitting in this room when the house was new, not as a guest, not as Mrs. Thomas Caldwell, as the woman whose capital hand-eye and will had made the space. She imagined her hearing footsteps in the hall, seeing Thomas enter with Arthur Pembroke, trust still intact, papers not yet weaponized, the future not yet stolen. Then she imagined the same woman years later after Thomas died, after Arthur arrived with documents, after the county accepted a transfer built on language dense enough to hide theft inside legality. Leaving, not because she wanted to leave, because the world had arranged itself to make staying impossible. Margaret's hands rested on the arms of the chair. She didn't lose this house, she said. Helen looked at her. Margaret's voice remained quiet, but there was something in it now that had not been there before. Not anger exactly, something steadier. It was taken from her. Helen did not answer. Margaret looked toward the entry hall, toward the staircase where Josephine had signed the underside of the newel post with her initials and the year. And she knew no one would believe her. The words sat in the room. Margaret continued. So she left the proof where someone would have to go looking. Back in the kitchen, Helen returned to the records. After 1893, the public documents changed shape. Josephine disappeared from the society columns. She disappeared from the property filings. She disappeared from the house she had built and became a line in the city directory. J. Caldwell, single room, Merchant Street, one address. Then another year, the same address. And another, 40 years. Helen read the entries softly year by year until the repetition became heavier than any single revelation could have been. 1901, J. Caldwell, Merchant Street. 1908, Josephine M. Caldwell, Rooming House, Merchant Street. 1916, J. Caldwell, Domestic Work. 1924, Josephine Caldwell, Single Room. Margaret stood at the kitchen table, one hand resting near the architectural drawings. From Caldwell House to a rented room. From original owner to directory listing. From architect of arches and windows to a woman counted by the rooms she occupied. Then Helen found the death record. She had placed it in a folder of copied documents from the city archive. She took it out carefully, read it once to herself, then set it on the table rather than handing it directly to Margaret. Margaret looked down. Josephine M. Caldwell. Date of death 1933. Occupation domestic. Property none. Helen's voice was quiet. Domestic, property none. The words did not merely sit in the room. They altered it. On the same table were Josephine's architectural drawings, her deed, her notations, her measurements, her handwriting, her proof of ownership, her statement, I built this house. It was mine. And beside them, the final public record of her life. Domestic, property none. Margaret placed her palm flat on the table. For a moment, she felt the full cruelty of official language, not because it shouted, because it did not, because it could take the woman who designed Caldwell House and reduce her to 2 words that contained none of her. Helen looked toward the open tunnel entrance beyond the kitchen hall. The flagstone panel had been left lifted, the temporary work light still casting a faint glow downward. The cellar below was quiet, holding its own air, its own dark, its own secret now emptied onto the kitchen table. She went down there herself, Helen said. Margaret followed her gaze. Helen continued. At some point after 1893, after she knew it was over, she came back here. She found a way into the tunnel. She sealed that alcove with the deed, the drawings, the note. Margaret imagined it. Josephine returning to the house that had been taken from her. Not through the front door as owner, but perhaps at night. Perhaps with help. Perhaps alone, because by then she had learned that help could not be assumed. She imagined Josephine carrying the tin box down the stone steps. The deed, the drawings, the note, the last thing she had that could still speak when no one living would. Helen looked at the open darkness. Why would she do that? She said, unless she believed someone would find it. Margaret did not answer immediately. She looked at the two boxes on the table. Josephine's tin box, Walter's wooden box, one hidden by the woman who lost everything, one carried for decades by a man who inherited the benefit of what had been taken. Between them lay the house itself, stone arch window stair cellar, not passive at all now, but witness. Margaret looked toward the staircase. Josephine's initials were still there. JMC, 1889. Not in the county record. Not in the newspaper. Not on the death certificate. In the wood, where hands could find it if they were willing to look beneath the surface. Margaret turned back to Helen. Josephine's story isn't finished, she said. Helen looked at her. No, she said, it isn't. Margaret gathered the death record and placed it beside the architectural drawings deliberately so that no one looking at the table could miss the contradiction. The public record said property none. The drawing said otherwise. The deed said otherwise. The house said otherwise. Margaret looked once more at Josephine's note. I built this house. It was mine. Then she reached for her phone. We need the Historical Society, she said, and the county recorder, and a title historian who understands 19th century transfers. Helen picked up her notepad again. And, Walter, Margaret looked toward the road, though she could no longer see him from the kitchen. Walter gave us what he carried, she said. Now we give Josephine back what they took. Helen wrote that down. Then she paused and looked at the tunnel entrance one more time. Before we go further, she said softly, people need to know this story. Margaret looked at the house around them, the arch, the windows, the light, the staircase, the rooms Josephine had designed, and history had misnamed. Yes, they did. Josephine's story was not finished, and neither was Margaret's. She left one more thing. The next morning, Helen went back into the tunnel with a camera, a measuring tape, and the kind of seriousness Margaret had come to trust in her. Margaret was in the kitchen sorting copies into separate folders, deed architectural drawings, Pembroke Letters death record when she heard Helen call from below. Not loudly. Just her name. Margaret. There was something in the way she said it that made Margaret set the papers down immediately. She crossed the kitchen, stepped around the lifted flagstone panel, and descended into the tunnel with one hand against the stone wall. The air below was still cool, still dry, still carrying that old preserved smell of lime earth and time. Helen stood beside the alcove. The main recess was empty now. The tin box was upstairs, its contents spread into the world at last. But Helen was not looking at the main recess. She was looking lower, slightly to the left. There, she said. Margaret followed her finger. At first she saw only shadow. Then as Helen shifted the work light, the shape appeared a second recess, much smaller than the first set, low into the wall, no wider than a woman's hand and not much taller. It had been nearly invisible the day before, half covered by the fallen edge of the oilcloth that had wrapped the deed. The stones around it had been fitted so cleanly that even Margaret, trained to see alterations in old buildings, had missed it. She hid it behind the hiding place, Helen said quietly. Margaret knelt. The small recess had no tin box, no latch, no document packet, only a square of cloth folded carefully, browned with age but still holding its shape. Margaret reached in with both hands. The cloth came free easily. It was soft from age, fragile at the edges, and wrapped around something solid and curved. Margaret placed it on her palm and unfolded it slowly, one corner at a time. Inside was a small oval frame, brass, tarnished almost black at the edges. The glass was dusty but unbroken. Margaret held it closer to the light. And there she was, Josephine May Caldwell. Not a signature, not a deed name, not initials under a staircase, not a line in a directory or a death record that called her occupation domestic and her property none. A face. A woman standing in front of Caldwell House when the stone was still new, and the window still held the brightness of completion. She looked to be in her late 20s or early 30s. Her dress was dark, structured, precise. One hand rested lightly against the side of the entry arch. Behind her, just over her shoulder, was the east window curve Margaret had studied in the architectural drawings. There was no doubt. It was this house. Josephine was looking directly into the camera. She was not smiling. She was not fearful. Her expression was composed in a way that made Margaret's throat tighten, the expression of a woman who understood exactly what she had made and exactly who she was before the world began working to rename both. Helen came closer but did not reach for the frame. She put her own portrait down here, Helen said. Margaret could not answer. The tunnel seemed to narrow around the photograph. The stone, the darkness, the opened recess, the emptied alcove, all of it had been evidence until this moment. Now it was something else. Josephine had not hidden only proof. She had hidden herself. After the deed, after the drawings, after the note, after the house was taken, after the newspapers had called her Mrs. Caldwell and the records had reduced her to a rented room, she had returned to this place with her own face wrapped in cloth and sealed it into the wall, so that if anyone ever found the truth, they would not have to imagine her. They would know where to look. Margaret held the portrait for a long time in the tunnel light. Helen waited. No one rushed the moment. At last, Margaret stood. "Let's take her upstairs," she said. They brought the portrait to the kitchen table and placed it beside the deed. Helen fetched cotton gloves, a soft brush, and a clean cloth. Together they cleaned the frame carefully, not trying to make it new, only trying to remove what time had placed between Josephine and the room. The brass brightened at the edges first, then the curve of the frame, then the glass. Josephine's face grew clearer slowly, as if she were arriving from far away and had agreed at last to be seen. Margaret lifted the portrait when they were finished and carried it into the parlor. She knew where it belonged before she crossed the threshold. The mantel. Josephine had designed that mantel into every draft. It appeared in the 1887 sketch revised in 1888, finalized in 1889. Not oversized, not ornamental for the sake of display. A warm center for the room, a place where light fire and conversation could gather. Margaret placed the oval portrait in the center of it. For a moment the room changed. Not dramatically, not like a revelation in a film, more like a name being spoken correctly after years of being mispronounced. Helen stood in the doorway. "She looks like she belongs there," she said. Margaret looked at the portrait, at the arch, at the windows, at the room Josephine had made, and history had occupied without thanking her. "She does," Margaret said. That afternoon, Margaret drove to the old municipal cemetery. She went alone. Helen had offered, but Margaret said no. There were some errands, she said, that needed only one person and the truth. The cemetery sat on the eastern edge of town behind an iron gate that had lost most of its paint. Old maples lined the narrow drives. The newer stones stood upright in neat rows near the front, polished and legible. The older section lay farther back, closer to the low ground where the grass grew unevenly and the stones had settled at slight angles. Margaret found Josephine in the eastern section. It took nearly 40 minutes. There was no monument, no carved phrase, no mention of Caldwell House, only a flat, standard-issue stone half sunk at the edges with a name and 2 dates. Josephine M. Caldwell, 1861 to 1933. That was all. Margaret stood over it with the folder under her arm. The wind moved through the cemetery grass. Somewhere behind her, a truck passed on the county road and then faded. She thought of the portrait on the mantel, the deed on the table, the drawings, the line in Josephine's note. "I built this house. It was mine." Then she opened the folder and took out one copy of the architectural sketch, the parlor elevation from 1888, the one with the mantel, the chair placement, and the east-facing light. In the lower margin in Josephine's hand was the note Margaret had not been able to stop thinking about. "East light morning only. This is where she will want to sit." Margaret read it aloud, not loudly. There was no audience, or perhaps there was only the one audience that mattered. "East light morning only," she said. "This is where she will want to sit." The words seemed impossibly tender in that place. A margin note from a woman designing a room for someone, maybe herself, maybe a future self, maybe the woman she hoped she would be when the house was finished and peace had settled into it. A note about light, about sitting, about wanting. Not ownership language, not legal defense, just a human intention written in pencil beside a room she had made. Margaret knelt carefully and placed her hand on the flat stone. "I found you," she said. Then after a moment, "I'm sorry it took so long." She stayed there longer than she intended. The cemetery did not answer. It did not need to. Some apologies are not meant to change the past. They are meant to mark the moment when the past is no longer being ignored. When Margaret finally stood, the light had shifted. Driving back, she took the road along the ridge instead of the shorter way through town. From there, Caldwell House appeared on the hill. Before the driveway did its stone face catching the late afternoon sun, its east windows darker now, but still visible. Margaret slowed. Then she pulled over. For a long moment she sat with both hands on the steering wheel and looked at the mansion. The east window was clear from the road, the one Josephine had placed deliberately, the one that caught morning light, the one beside the room where Josephine's portrait now stood on the mantel, finally inside the house, again finally visible, finally occupying the space her own hand had made. Margaret did not start the car immediately. She simply looked. The house no longer seemed abandoned to her, not even troubled. It seemed alert, as if something inside it had heard its name spoken and was waiting for what came next. Margaret thought of the portrait in the parlor, the flat stone in the cemetery, the sentence on the sketch. This is where she will want to sit. Then she looked again at the east window. Yes, she said softly, and after another moment she drove home. Her name on her house. Margaret made the first phone call at 8:30 the next morning. County Historical Society, then the State Architectural Registry, then the Recorder's Office, then a local stonemason whose father had repaired the east wall of Caldwell House in 1968 and whose grandfather, according to town memory, had once refused to replace original stone with cheaper material because old work deserves old respect. By noon, the kitchen table was no longer only a table. It had become an archive. The original 1889 deed lay at the center Josephine May Caldwell's name, clear in the grantee field. Beside it were the architectural sketches, 6 sheets dated from 1887 to 1889, each signed in the lower corner by J. Caldwell. Walter Pembroke's wooden box sat open to the right, its contents arranged carefully. Arthur Pembroke's 1893 letter to his lawyer, the forged transfer document, the 1895 letter declaring that the widow had removed herself to the city and that the matter was resolved. Margaret had read that sentence so many times now that it no longer shocked her. That did not make it less terrible. It only made it clearer. Helen sat across from her with a notepad writing names, dates, office numbers, reference codes. She had made coffee, neither of them drank. The county recorder's office was the first to call back. The woman on the phone did not speak quickly. Margaret appreciated that. Some things deserved exact language. "We cannot undo the 1893 recording," she said, "but given the original deed, the transfer irregularities, and the supporting Pembroke papers, we can flag the 1893 transfer as historically contested and attach a title note to the property record." Margaret closed her eyes for 1 second. Historically contested. Not reversed. Not repaired. But no longer clean. No longer silent. "That will remain with the title record?" she asked. "Yes. Permanently." "Yes, Miss Hale. Permanently." Margaret looked at Josephine's portrait on the parlor mantel through the open doorway. "Do it," she said. The State Architectural Registry took longer. There were forms, photographs, scans, supporting statements, proof that the drawings matched the structure. Margaret had expected this and had already prepared half of it before anyone asked. 40 years as a preservation architect had taught her that institutions move slowly, but they moved better when you handed them exactly what they needed, in the order they expected to receive it. 2 weeks later, the registry issued its formal amendment. Caldwell House, 1889, designed and financed by Josephine May Caldwell, 1887 to 1889. Architectural significance revised to reflect original owner-designer attribution. Margaret read the line 5 times. Designed and financed by Josephine May Caldwell. Not Mrs. Thomas Caldwell. Not Caldwell Estate. Not unknown builder. Josephine May Caldwell. Helen was standing beside her when she read it. "She got her sentence," Helen said. Margaret folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the portrait. "No," she said softly. "She got her name." The Historical Society moved fastest of all, perhaps because it was local. Perhaps because Sylvia Haynes, the society director, had the particular anger of a woman who had spent 30 years watching women's names disappear from donor lists, building records, church plaques, property files, and family histories under the soft eraser of somebody else's surname. Sylvia came to the house herself. She walked the parlor slowly. She stood beneath the staircase. She read the initials carved into the underside of the newel post. JMC 1889. Then she stood in the kitchen and read Josephine's note aloud, though Margaret had not asked her to. "I built this house, it was mine." Sylvia did not speak for a long moment after that. When she did, she said, "We'll register it properly." The Historical Society entry was published the following Friday. Caldwell House established 1889, Josephine May Caldwell architect, an original owner. Margaret printed it. Then she printed a second copy. One went into her file. The other she placed in the parlor beneath Josephine's portrait, where the morning light could touch it. The stonemason came in November. His name was Elias Hart. He was younger than Margaret expected, perhaps 40, with strong hands, and the quiet concentration of a man who understood that letters cut into metal were not decoration if the name had been missing long enough. He brought the brass plaque wrapped in felt. Margaret did not open it immediately. She carried it to the front entrance and set it on the hall table while Elias measured the wall beside the door. Not too high, not too low. Eye level, Margaret had said. A person should not have to look up to see Josephine's name, and they should not have to look down either. Elias nodded as if he understood exactly. The plaque read, "Caldwell House, designed and financed by Josephine May Caldwell, 1887 to 1889, architect owner, builder of record." Margaret touched the edge of the brass with one finger. Builder of record. That phrase had been Helen's suggestion. "Because that's what this is," Helen had said. Not a tribute, a correction. The small gathering was held the following Saturday. Margaret had refused anything larger. The Historical Society wanted a formal unveiling. The county paper wanted a feature. The state registry offered to send someone for photographs. Margaret said they could come, but the house would not be staged into a celebration. This was not a celebration. It was a return. So the gathering remained small. Margaret, Helen, Sylvia from the Historical Society, 2 local historians, a reporter from the county paper, Elias the stonemason standing near the entrance with dust still on his boots, and Walter Pembroke. He stood at the back. He did not come forward when he arrived. He did not offer his hand to Margaret in front of the others. He simply stepped inside, removed his hat, and stood near the parlor doorway with his eyes lowered toward the floor. Margaret saw him. She gave the smallest nod. He returned it. That was enough. The plaque was already mounted. There was no cloth to pull away, no ribbon, no staged reveal. Margaret had insisted it be visible when people arrived. Josephine's name had been hidden long enough. When everyone had gathered near the entrance, Sylvia said a few words about records correction and the responsibility of local history to revise itself when truth arrived. The reporter took notes. The historians stood with folded hands. Helen watched Margaret. Then Margaret stepped forward with Josephine's note in her hand. Not the original. That was already protected. A copy. But the words were hers. Margaret unfolded the page. Her voice was steady when she read. Thomas did not understand what he signed. He trusted Arthur as he trusted everyone. "I did not know until Mr. Pembroke arrived with the papers. I have no legal standing. I have nowhere to appeal." She paused. No one moved. Walter looked at the floor. Margaret continued, "I am writing this so that someone will know. I built this house. It was mine." The house seemed to hold the sentence. The parlor arch, the east windows, the staircase, the cellar below, the mantel where Josephine's portrait stood watching the room that had finally learned how to speak her name. Margaret folded the paper. No applause followed. No one seemed to know whether applause belonged in a moment like that. Good, Margaret thought. It did not. After the others had moved into the parlor, Walter approached the plaque. He stood before it for a long time. Margaret watched from the hall. At last he lifted his hand, but he did not touch the brass. His fingers stopped an inch from the name. Josephine May Caldwell. "I should have done something sooner," he said. Margaret stood beside him. "Yes," she said. He closed his eyes. The word was not cruel. It was not forgiving either. It was simply large enough to hold the truth. After the gathering, when the reporter had gone and Sylvia had taken her copies, and Elias had checked the plaque one final time with the pride of a craftsman pretending not to be proud, Margaret went down to the cellar alone. The tunnel entrance was still open. For weeks she had imagined sealing it again, restoring the flagstone, returning the floor to its original continuity. But now, standing at the top of the steps, she understood that closure was not the same as concealment. She descended slowly. The tunnel was cool and dry, the work light casting a small amber circle over the opened alcove. The main recess was empty. The smaller one where the portrait had waited was empty too. Margaret stood before them. Josephine did not hide those documents hoping to be rescued. Not really. She had hidden them knowing she would not be. She had hidden them because she believed decades out, perhaps a century, that someone would come into the house and care enough to look beneath what had been said, beneath what had been filed, beneath what had been accepted. Someone would go into the dark. Someone would find the name. Margaret looked at the empty alcove. She was right, she said. Then she closed the tunnel door gently. Not sealed. Closed. There was a difference. The next morning, Margaret sat in the parlor. She had moved a small chair to the place Josephine's drawing had indicated near the east window where the morning light arrived first. The architectural sketches lay spread on the table beside her. Josephine's portrait stood on the mantel. The brass plaque at the entrance caught light from the hall. The room was quiet, not empty. Quiet in the way a room becomes quiet when it has finally been named correctly. Morning light entered through the east window and crossed the floor in the exact path Josephine had planned more than 130 years earlier. Margaret sat inside that light. She thought of the margin note. East light morning only. This is where she will want to sit. For a long time, Margaret did nothing but sit there. Then she looked at Josephine's portrait and spoke softly as if finishing a conversation that had begun in a sealed wall, passed through a tunnel, crossed a cemetery, and returned at last to the room where it belonged. She built this house so a woman could sit in this light in this room on a morning just like this one. She looked toward the east window. I think she always knew it would be a stranger. The light warmed her hands. I think she built it for all of us. If Josephine's story stayed with you, subscribe and leave a comment. Tell me, what would you have done if you had found that tin box? Would you have kept the secret, or would you have put her name back where it belonged?